Hello, welcome again to Stars, Cells, and God. This is the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science, discoveries that have theological and philosophical implications, and even discoveries that point to the reality of God's existence. My name is Jeff Zweerink. I'll be your host today. I'm joined once again with Dr. Kyle Keltz in our studio. But before we get into our discussion, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, Reasons to Believe. Click on that bell icon so you can be informed of our new videos. Learn more at reasons.org or follow us on social media at RTB_official. Kyle, good to have you back in the studio again today.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here.
So we're just going to jump in a little quicker this time. We're talking about Aquinas and his 5 ways, not 5 proofs, but 5 ways that point to God,
Right.
Given the metaphysics of the time. And I'm just going to open it up to, or throw the floor over to you, because I think we're talking about the 5th way today. So why don't you explain or tell us what the 5th way talks about?
Yes, we're looking at Aquinas' arguments for God's existence, called the 5 ways. So we were mentioning earlier that they're not necessarily mathematical proofs or claim to be something like that. It's just him providing a sort of deductive argument, just logical argument, trying to show that there's evidence in the universe that there must be something like God that exists, right?
So in some sense, this is kind of a way of looking at the way the universe is, and in reasoning about it, it points to God.
Yes.
So it's not given this, God must exist, but given the way that works, it makes sense that God exists, or these are arguments that argue for his existence.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is known as the 5th way because it was listed last in his work. And what some people call it is the argument from final causality. We mentioned earlier that the 5 ways, the first one is from change, and then you start to, it's Aquinas looking at the world according to the doctrine of the 4 causes.
Okay.
The second way is efficient causality. The third way is material. 4th way is formal. When we get to the 5th way, this is him looking at the nature of final causality and trying to argue that this points to right here and now, God must exist, or we wouldn't see teleology in nature, is basically what it's arguing.
Okay, and I know teleology is a loaded term, so it'd probably be useful for you to define what you mean by teleology there.
Yes. So the 5th way is most commonly attributed, and I would argue, the big misconception about it is that it is like a proto-design argument. With design arguments, a lot of times they're attributed to William Paley, arguing that you see something in nature that seems to have design, so it couldn't have formed by random chance. And then, he applies that analogously. I hope I explained that correctly. I know Fazal Rana likes to be really clear on what he's specifically saying. But with intelligent design and fine-tuning and design arguments today, this is a very different concept of teleology that Aristotle and Aquinas are working with. The design that you see, right? So it makes me think of like Michael Behe's flagellum, right? He was saying that these biological systems couldn't have formed in a random stepwise fashion, so therefore they must have been designed by some intelligence. That kind of design is extrinsic.
Okay.
And what we're talking about with this kind of teleology that Aristotle and Aquinas are working with is like an intrinsic teleology, something just in regular, natural ways, just regularly does something. And the example that we use often is an acorn growing into an oak tree. An acorn is what it is, and it's obviously not an oak tree at one time.
Okay.
But given the right conditions, given the soil and water and all that, an acorn aims at or always tends to grow into an oak tree. It's just what it does.
So we can look at the typical design arguments that the universe, if the laws of physics were different, if the speed of light was different, if the number of galaxies and what kind of galaxy and planet and star it takes, and how life works, the flagellum, and all of those aspects of design, in that I have fashioned something to work perfectly for its environment type.
Right.
That is a form of teleology, but that's not the teleology you're talking.
Yeah.
If I get what you're saying, the teleology here is more, it's just the patterns and regularity we see, that acorns always grow into oak trees.
Right.
They don't, grow into other kinds of trees. They don't make automobiles. They always grow into oak trees. So that's it's really just the pattern almost.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it can be, you can think of chemistry, you think about like maybe what's the half-life of some element. The idea would be, why is that constant?
Okay.
How come some elements don't break down at faster rates? Why are they always breaking down at the same rate? It's just any kind of regularity you see in nature. And we discussed this. I think what really helps make sense out of it is thinking about the historical background of what Aristotle was working with.
Okay.
We talked about the school of atomism, kind of the logical outworking of what all the pre-Socratics were doing, and they thought that all the substances we have in reality are just a collection of atoms, right? They explained reality in terms of an infinite number of atoms and an infinite void.
So in their view of atoms, were atoms all the same thing?
Yeah,
or were atoms different? Could you have different kinds of atoms?
They were somewhat different.
They were, okay.
They were just these really small particles that might have different shapes and sizes, but that's about all the properties they have.
Okay,
They don't have color, they don't have a smell or taste, but so there's an infinite number of them, and because there's no resting place in an infinite void, they thought they were just eternally in motion.
Okay,
So just
all right.
random eternal motion, and that explains everything. Well, Aristotle looks out in nature and goes, okay, so what you're telling me is when some atoms just come together in a certain way, you just get an acorn. Okay. But if they're randomly going in all these different directions, how come acorns always grow into oak trees? It seems like, because and this has to do with some of the things we've been talking about, right? How come an acorn grows into an oak tree? And what an acorn is not an oak tree. What it is to be an oak tree somehow is potentially in the acorn, but why is it always doing that? Why doesn't thinking that everything is completely random in the atomist sense? How come an acorn doesn't pop into popcorn? How come an acorn doesn't start make some noise like a bus honking a horn or something? Like, it seems to be a lot more regular than we would expect if everything was completely random in the atomistic sense. So I think one thing that people might get caught up on is, I'm not arguing that scientists today believe that everything is random in that sense. It's just that if you are willing to accept that there's regularities in nature, you would be agreeing with the kind of teleology that we're looking at here.
That's one of the things that strikes me as profound about this, is that, I have to imagine that, from Adam and Eve on, people have looked at the world and it's like, there's an order and a regularity. I mean, if nothing else, the sun always comes up, the moon, it's like things just happen a certain way. And what strikes me about that is that it's so obvious that it's so intuitive that it's almost impossible to believe it otherwise. And so that's where that atomistic behavior of how do you get random, how does it all come about? It really is a stark contrast of, okay, no, there's an order and a regularity as opposed to this. The fact that we now look at it as so, well, duh, still doesn't mean it's not important and needs to be explained.
Yes. I really, sometimes I think that the 5 ways, if they don't do anything else, they show us what we take for granted about reality.
Yeah.
The second way, I think it just shows that we take existence for granted. And like you're saying, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, so you're telling me that an acorn growing into an oak tree shows me that God exists. Like, how could that possibly be? Of course it grows into an oak tree. We don't need God to explain that. But that's the fun thing about what the 5th way is doing.
Right.
There's what I have down is kind of 3 steps, maybe what Aquinas, how he would explain it, and then a conclusion.
Okay.
You want me to go ahead
Yeah,
and just read those out?
Let's hear those.
All right. So here's how Aquinas might say it. Things in nature that don't have intelligence act for ends.
Okay.
So they do not achieve their ends simply by random chance. Things cannot move toward an end without being guided by an intellect. Thus, there must be an intelligent being who is the source of all teleology in nature, and this is what we would call God. That
strikes me as the first 2 are not that disputable or contentious. The third one people are going to disagree with, and so the fourth, the conclusion. So I just kind of walk through. Let's read the first one again.
Okay,
or
so we've been covering this a lot already, just trying to be careful about what we mean by teleology. So, things in nature that don't have intelligence act for ends.
So why is that distinguish about the don't have intelligence? Because it seems almost implicit in there. The moment you have intelligence, that things acting towards ends makes sense. So why is that important?
Yeah, well, that leads all into the third step.
Okay.
Really, that's a major thing.
Gotcha.
That when we establish that's how we do the third step. I like to be clear when it says things in nature that don't have intelligence act for ends. Acting for an end, it sounds inherently right, almost like we're anthropomorphizing, but
purposeful. No, I get you.
So step one is not saying it's not like Toy Story or something where we think that inanimate objects are for because it's saying they don't have intelligence, and so like an acorn, it doesn't know that it should turn into an oak tree. So that's what this is saying, and it's what we just described. Thinking about what the atomists were saying about reality, everything being random in that sense, whenever we see regularity in nature, it becomes striking if we were going to assume atomism. But what we're just saying is that it looks like acorns, unimpeded, always grow into oak trees, so how come that? Is what we're getting at in step one.
Right. Well, and as a scientist, there's your example of acorns growing into oak trees is somewhat unsurprising, and it's a little bit too specific, because if I look at the acorn, I recognize, and maybe this is a little too loaded in the way to say it. It's like there's a set of instructions in there that tell it to grow into an oak tree. So it's not just like, oh wow, this grows into an oak tree. It's like, no, I could actually, given my knowledge, could explain, oh, there's DNA in here. This is what the structure. This is going to play out. So I could actually articulate in principle. I don't think we have all the steps yet, but given this arrangement of atoms, I know we're going to get an oak tree. So
yeah.
But if I get what's going on here, that's whether I can explain it in more detail, all that does is just amplify that there's a teleology about it, because it's so orderly and regular that given this arrangement of atoms, I know I'm going to get an oak tree.
Right.
The pattern becomes even stronger, if you will.
Yeah. And we probably should just go on to step three. So step two is just saying they don't achieve their ends simply by random chance. And I like to just again say that we're not talking about we're not trying to argue against evolution here.
Right.
In fact, that's a misconception of this argument. Some people think that if you could establish that evolution is true, it would show that things are forming by chance. But that's not the kind of chance we're talking about, right?
Okay, so
we're
what's
contrasting this with the atomists and just saying that because this thing that without a mind is aiming at this end, there's this form, this actuality that it's aiming at, and that form, that actuality needs to be accounted for in some way, because if everything was completely random, then maybe acorns could grow and pop into a daisy, pop into popcorn. It would just be a really bizarro world where everything truly is completely random in that atomistic sense. And I hope we're being fair to the atomists, but I would they probably would reject that. But the thing is, it just seems like that's what you would kind of predict given their idea of what reality is like. So
well, but even it seems to me, even if evolution is the explanation for things, there's still the teleology and the way you're describing it built into it, because
right, exactly.
There are places where fluctuations, mutations, randomness does occur, but it happens in the overall context of things being very regular and orderly.
Right.
And so the randomness is almost a part of the order in some sense there, which is very different than, if I get what you're saying of the atomists, that things are just moving outside of bouncing off. That's really the only order. So the fact that there's this collection of random things moving in the same way is really unusual.
Yeah, RNA making DNA encoding for RNA, that's the kind of regularity that is this inherent teleology that we're talking about. So it's like you said, throughout all this random process, there's still a regularity within it inherently So it's not getting around the teleology that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So really, I think where we need to spend most of our time is step 3, right? Things cannot move toward an end without being guided by an intellect.
Now, I would agree with that, but it also seems like a bald-faced statement. I'm just declaring this to be true. So
Yes.
Flesh this out a little bit more for us.
So, I was wanting to kind of discuss formal causality a little bit. I think this is a really fun concept that's helpful to just briefly discuss to help us truly grasp why there is some kind of immaterial thing going on here that's not answered if we just say, well, the laws of nature or something like that. So I'd just like to just quickly discuss Aristotle's formal causality. Formal causality is not usually something that's quantifiable. It's something that Descartes didn't like. The modern philosophers got rid of this so they could have a streamlined way of learning about reality, which we know now turned into what we know of as science.
I think that's an important point to bring up. I read this, and I think you would agree with it. A couple of people I was reading said that, when you look at the efficient, the material, the final, or the formal and the final cause, that if you try and view the world in that way, science is really hard to do because it's too rigid of a structure. That when you kind of get rid of the final formal cause, now you can deal with the efficient, the material. And that's what really allowed the scientific enterprise to grow and flourish.
Yes. Descartes didn't like final causality. He thought that the only way to truly know what the purpose of something is to know the mind of God.
Okay.
They didn't like formal causality. Formal causality in one sense is saying something is what it is. So it's like they're just like, I'm wearing a sweater that's getting snagged on all the things. Let me just take that off.
Okay.
I'll feel more comfortable. We'll get things done quicker. So the thing is, final and formal causality just aren't as quantifiable. So they're really just kind of leftover things in science. But I wanted to focus on formal causality. So, when we talked about form-matter composites, there's the actuality and the potentiality. So, in a sense, the form of something is what the thing is.
Okay.
And people might be thinking, what does this have to do with science? It is what it is. Like, yeah, we use that all the time. But an example that I think, and actually contemporary researchers, a lot of times they'll use the term emergence. So this is almost like Aristotle's thought coming all the way back to life in contemporary research. People are seeing something like formal causality, but they're calling it emergence. But I wanted to show everybody an example of emergence. So, but we talked about this, right? NaCl. When you put sodium and chlorine together to get salt. Now, thinking about kind of how the atomists were describing reality, they were saying that you just put some atoms together and you just get the substance. And one thing that we kind of I want to say is you would predict from this kind of thinking is that when you put things together, the sum of the thing you get is just going to be the sum of the parts, right? So if I put Na and Cl together, I'm going to get something that just looks like you just adding those things together with all the properties adding on to each other and still existing.
So the properties of sodium, the properties of chlorine, this highly reactive metallic substance, chlorine, this gaseous at standard temperature pressure, yellowish, caustic. The expectation that salt would have those properties, some mix of those properties mixed together. That's what is what you're saying. Okay.
But, right, when you put NaCl together, you get salt, and that is very different from both chlorine and sodium as individual elements in themselves.
Right.
So what we get is just saltness. You get salt. It doesn't have these properties of its constituent particles. You get this new substance, and what it is to be salt is not explained in terms of what it is to be chlorine and sodium, right? It's not just adding the properties together. You're getting You're getting a completely new thing. So in a sense, and I know you kind of I like whenever you question me on this because it really helps to bring it all out. Because we understand how it's happening, right? But what I'm saying is what it is to be salt is not, like we said, the salt is not just a summation of the properties of chlorine and sodium. So you get what it is to be salt. Why is it that NaCl has these properties? It's just because that's just what salt is.
Yeah, no, I'm sitting here thinking in my head, I was like, well, I know why sodium has the properties it does, because it's got a certain set of a nuclear configuration with so many protons, so many neutrons, and it's got a single electron in its outer shell, and so it's not sodium per se, it's the properties of the protons and neutrons and the electrons that give it the properties you have. Now you take chlorine, it's got so many protons, neutrons in its nucleus, and then it's got a shell that is missing or has one less electron than what it wants to have. So given them in isolation, yeah, they behave. This is the way the protons, neutrons, and electrons act. This is the way the protons, neutrons, and electrons act. When you put them together, their protons, electrons, the protons and neutrons kind of stay isolated in their cells, but the electrons now behave very differently because effectively the sodium gives the chlorine an extra electron, and now you just got very different properties. So in some sense, thinking sodium and thinking chlorine as fundamental as the problem, it's really it's how the electrons and protons and neutrons are arranged.
Yes. Yeah, and you start talking about arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about what it is, and so in a sense, and we would argue that when you explain how it happens, you're explaining like the material and efficient causality maybe of it, but ultimately we're still saying, well, what it is to be salt is different from what it is to be these other two things.
Okay.
There's these new properties, there's this new actuality to it, and that wasn't there before in sodium and chlorine as sodium and chlorine. So there's this new form that just is here. So why is salt the way it is? Well, part of it is because of just what it is to be salt. Mm-hmm. When you arrange it in that pattern, in that way, you just get salt. You just get those properties.
Yeah, well, and it also seems to me, even if you do talk about it in terms of protons, neutrons, and electrons, why does this arrangement of protons, neutrons, and electrons behave this way? This one behaves this way. Put them together, they're still the same ones, but you get something very there's still there's a pattern to it.
Yeah, it's like you're learning the rules of reality. When you put these two things together, you just get this. Why is that? Why isn't it something else? Don't know. That's just what it is, right? Mm-hmm. And we're kind of seeing formal causality through all this because salt emerges from what it is to be salt emerges from NaCl, but also we're seeing that when you put NaCl together, you always get salt. So that's also kind of final causality. NaCl, when they get put together, are aiming towards salt, even though the salt doesn't exist yet. So we kind of have this, what it is to be salt, this form of salt that's almost because it doesn't exist at one time, then it does. So so the idea, the pattern of salt is something about reality that's almost like this immaterial principle that we need to explain. How come that if everything was completely random? And I love and I hope I'm not getting onto you or pointing out something that maybe you shouldn't be doing, but I love the almost anthropomorphic language you're using. It's hard to talk about it, right? Because with the regularities, you want to say stuff like it wants to get this.
No, you're right. Yeah,
it wants to do that, so it's really hard to not talk about it using teleological language because we just are seeing teleology. What the things are just determines that they act in certain ways, and that's not what we would expect. Thinking about everything being completely random on a fundamental level.
Yeah. Well, it almost seems like I know that word teleology has a loaded. You say teleology and people have strong reactions. That's what I mean by a loaded term there. But that teleology is like there's a goal, a purpose. That's not really that controversial. I mean, you put things together, and the acorn will grow into the oak tree. That's not a controversial idea, but it does embody something that's very fundamental to how the world works.
Yes, and here's where we get into the part where Aquinas says this only happens with an intellect,
right?
In some way. So, right, because the acorn is aiming at an oak tree, even though the acorn doesn't have a mind, And we just pointed out, and that's why I like to point out formal causality. The acorn is aiming at the form of an oak tree. So what it is to be an oak tree is what it's going towards in a certain way of saying it. And what we're saying is, well, this all goes to Aristotle's thought as well, and Aquinas mentions this. This hylomorphic understanding of reality with all substances being form, matter composites, right?
So explain what hylomorphic is. I've had a general sense of the term.
It's we've been getting around it. We've just really mentioned it, like with salt. Salt is the form of what it is to be salt, joined with some material stuff that makes it a particular instance of salt. So it's just saying that when you think of things, you can distinguish what it is from what instantiates it. Okay. And they come together as just one thing. It's just two different ways of thinking about it. Okay. But an acorn is aiming at this form of oak treeness. What it is to be an oak tree, it's aiming at that, even though it doesn't have a mind. With that hylomorphic metaphysics, what they're saying is that any particular thing just is what it is with the matter that's instantiating it. Okay, so it's got the form of the thing in it, and it's a particular instance of that. The issue is that Aristotle recognized was that what we're saying is if something has a form in it, it's just going to be what that is, right? So if the form of saltiness or saltness or salt is in some particular matter, it's going to be salt. If you have acornness or, what it is to be an acorn is in some matter, it's just going to be an acorn. So the idea, though, is that, but what they observe is, but what about human beings? Aristotle argued that, he disagreed with Plato that there's some realm of the forms where all these universal concepts are, and then they're casting themselves on reality. Because Aristotle was saying, well, whenever I look at things in nature, I learn about their essences. I learn about what they are. So in a sense, I'm abstracting the form of the thing into myself. Okay. But here's the issue. If a particular thing has the form of something in it, it's just going to be what that is. Does that make sense? This is known as what we call today the storage argument. Okay. So when you think about a human being, if I know what it is to be, I think the most helpful example, if I know what it is to be an elephant, that means that I, in a certain sense, have the form of an elephant in me. But when I think about an elephant, my head doesn't explode. So that means that
because it's not an elephant. It's you're thinking about the elephant, but the elephant isn't there.
And it's not. You could cut my head open. You're not going to find an elephant anywhere in there. So the form, what it is to be an elephant, is somehow in me, in my mind. Yet I'm not an instance of an elephant in any sense of the word. Okay. So what Aristotle and Aquinas argue is that so you're taking in the form, and this is evidence that there's something immaterial about our intellect. Our intellect stores universals, yet doesn't become what the form is. So therefore, our intellect must, in some sense, be immaterial. And this.
Go ahead. No, finish up.
I was just going to say this leads into why they're saying right. So our third step says things cannot move toward an end without being guided by an intellect. What they're saying is, right, the human intellect is the only thing that we know can store a form and then act to make that form become actual, right? So if I want to build a table, using a more natural example, if I want to grow an oak tree, I plant an acorn, right? Or if I want to make a table, I've got the form of the table, I've got what it is to be a table in my mind, then I take steps to make that form be actual.
Gotcha. So I was just thinking, in a previous episode, we talked about the second way and how you need an uncaused cause. I was asking the question, why cannot the physical stuff of the universe be the uncaused cause? Coupled that with this, the universe certainly has this capacity to change from hot, dense state to low energy state filled with stars, planets, and galaxies. But even though it wasn't stars, planets, and galaxies, it became stars, planets, and galaxies. If the fifth way is accurate, that needs an intelligence to guide it. So the universe can't be its own cause in that way.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay, so this is why, thinking about all of these together, or thinking about how these play together is really kind of what brings the compelling that, okay, this is what God is, rather than looking
yeah.
at them in isolation.
Right.
Okay, all right.
Yes, I would argue that the fifth way really is supplemental in the other ways.
Okay.
I think you get a better understanding of the cause through the first, second, third, and fourth ways. But the fifth way caps it all off by showing that this cause of the universe, this uncaused cause, this most perfect being, this necessary being, must be something that's personal because it has ideas in some sense within it, and it is causing it points to the same uncaused cause like you're mentioning. Because we're looking at reality and we're seeing that things aim towards a form, even though they don't have that actually within themselves. So whatever is causing the teleology is also going to be the thing causing the existence of the substance, or at least a fundamental reality. It's going to be the thing that it contains the forms of things, like the fourth way points to. It's going to be this source of all reality that's not a matter-form composite, pure actuality, pure existence. But the fifth way is showing us that just like how human beings are the only thing that we know of in nature that seems to be able to act for ends, to act rationally, but also to take in universals within our minds, but not become the thing. That points to this cause of the universe being something that's in some sense contains these ideas. It makes me think of the history of Western thought, where Plato thought that the forms were in a Platonic heaven. So the forms are just these immaterial principles that cause all of reality. Aristotle said, well, the forms have to be in the things. They can't just be in this other thing. And how does that even work? Later on, Augustine thought that the forms, it made more sense to say the forms were these ideas in God's mind.
Right, okay.
And God, through his power and will, is actualizing all this. And that's what the fifth way is pointing to.
Gotcha.
This, we've got the aiming at a goal needs to be accounted for, because it can't just be in the thing. So the teleology must come from that source of existence. And
so I'm just thinking, if I were a naturalist who thinks the physical world is all there is, there's a number of statements you make that I'm like, I'm not sure how I would respond. So the physical world is all there is. There's matter, there's atoms, they move around, they become different things. I can explain them using the laws of physics. Why did this assemblage of atoms become this? It has these properties. Why do I need to deal with matter-form composites? That seems like something extraneous that I'm throwing on there, that you're kind of saying, well, I need to introduce God into this or something immaterial, so I'm going to do it that way. Yeah. I think there's something fundamentally related to the ideas that Aristotle and Aquinas were wrestling with are still relevant today that we're missing, but I'm not quite sure why would you argue a naturalist is wrong to say that, oh, that's just extra stuff thrown on and I don't have to worry about it?
Yeah, well, when we were talking about the second way, we were kind of wrestling with talking about maybe everything's explainable in the terms of a fundamental force that just maybe necessarily exists. Maybe matter is eternal and it's just always been around with this force acting on it. And that's one of the. So we were struggling with that because we were asking, is this force something that just must exist of its own nature? Because that's what the second way was trying to get at. Even that force needs to be something that gets its existence from something external. Now, what I really like about this talk, though, is when we look at the fifth way, when we look at the regularity of it all, we can say that there's just a force that exists and that explains everything. But at least in terms of regularity, right? That's not explaining why it's regular. It's just describing that it is regular. So if we're more curious beyond that point, we just need to realize that if we're going to say that maybe the forces of nature, the laws of nature are just brute facts, we're not explaining them as much as we're just saying they're just these descriptions of the world that we need to just be comfortable with because there is no explanation, or at least there is no explanation further beyond what science can give us. We were talking about this, right? So I was mentioning I wanted to talk about, so it's I was reading this book that's really helpful. I think it was written for undergraduates. That's why I needed it. Right? I was reading a book by Alex Vilenkin, Delia Perlov. It's called Cosmology for the Curious, and they were trying to say that maybe they were talking about that idea that maybe all of our galaxies are explainable in terms of a quantum vacuum. Like, so in a flat universe, given expansion, maybe everything's explainable of all these galaxies coming out of a quantum vacuum. And they were saying that if that's the case, if everything came from nothing in a certain sense of the word, then it seems like maybe the laws of nature are more fundamental to reality than the universe itself.
Right.
But I remember in that book, Cosmology for the Curious, what they were saying is, and I love their honesty. I love the way they described it in a very non-polemic way. But they were saying that kind of when you get to this point, you're trying to explain everything in the laws of nature, you either need to be what they called a mathist. That would be basically what they were saying, is that would be someone who thinks that there's this impersonal, immaterial principle that they would call a law of nature is somehow causing all this to happen at all the moments in which it happens. They say you either need to be a mathist in that sense of the term, with that idea of what the laws of nature are, or you would just need to get to that point and say, well, we don't know why the laws of nature are the way they are or how they cause this. Maybe this is just the edge of science, and that's as far as science can get us as far as the explanation of things goes.
It really does seem like there are some fairly honest and candid scientists who recognize the philosophy, the philosophical implications. And I'll just use Max Tegmark because he's one of the people, and I'm taking this from a description that Ken gave of a book you read. But it seems like there are three things in the universe. There's mathematics, and there's matter, and there's a mind. And the question you're asking is, which of those is fundamental? In your description there, the math is fundamental, and it gives rise to the matter and the mind eventually.
Yes.
And I think, and in my view, the mind is fundamental because that's God. God is the mind.
Yes.
And the mind gives rise to the mathematics and eventually and the matter. But you're kind of left with those three things need an explanation, and you're kind of asking which one do you think is preeminent and fits the world better. So I appreciate the candidness of that discussion, because I think if somebody comes back and says, hey, I'm just more comfortable with this, I'm like, okay, we disagree, but we all realize the metaphysical implication or the metaphysical challenges we're dealing with there. Because to just say, oh, the world, the physical stuff is all there is, kind of negates what makes light of what all the how regular and how mindful things are.
Right.
Rather than appreciating all of those are hard, and that's a big thing. And so I think it's a more fruitful discussion. And it really seems like what Aquinas, what Aristotle are talking about, that's the discussion we're having here today. Centuries later, centuries after they were putting these ideas forth.
Yeah. And I like the way you kind of put that in terms of like, what is more fundamental, mind or matter or these forces? And I think, basically what the fifth way is doing is that they're saying empirically, when we look in the world, we see that human minds are the only things that are doing what would be an explanation for why things are regular. So we think, there must the cause of all this, the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, and the necessary being, the most perfect being, that must be a personal force,
right?
That does act for ends, or cause all this for a purpose, because that's all we're seeing. If I think maybe you could look at it another way. Kind of looking at where it leads to, right? Because it's fun, because it's like what Vilenkin was talking about. Kind of brings us all the way back to Plato, doesn't it? If you're going to say that the laws of nature just are this some kind of more fundamental than the physical universe, so some kind of immaterial principle, but it's impersonal, and that's what's causing everything. It's all of a sudden it's like we're right back to Plato,
right? And
the idea is, how can some kind of immaterial, impersonal, basically abstract object cause anything, and why would it? And so you could almost look at it in a more like abductive, what am I thinking of? Like, just thinking of it as competing theories. What is the best explanation of why things are regular? Would we expect it to be an impersonal, immaterial principle, or would we expect it to be something like an immaterial, all-powerful, personal mind that guides these things guides these non-intelligent things to these forms, to these actualities? And also, coupled with the fact that this is the only thing that we see in nature that does that is something that we think is probably immaterial in some way, which is the human intellect. So then maybe looking at it abductively, inference to the best explanation, we'd say that, you can either do the fifth way as an inductive argument, or you can treat it like a theory and say, what explains all this better? Yeah. I don't see, some immaterial principle that's impersonal doing a good job of that, or even having any potency whatsoever, like any power. Like, how could it cause that?
That's a really interesting point, and I'm going to have to think a little bit more about this, is, when we ask the question, what is it that causes things to move? I'm going to try to formulate. What is it that actually causes stuff more than just predictable motion? And there's only one thing that does that, and that is a mind. Yeah. And to say that the predictable motion causes the mind, that's a pretty big leap. Not that it's wrong, but that's just a big statement. That there needs to be some substantial evidence where the bulk of the evidence points to the mind causes the mind can explain the random motion or the regular motion. And so I think that's a pretty profound statement that has great relevance and ultimately dates back to what Aquinas and Aristotle were talking about.
And I'm sure, I know we probably need to wrap it up, but whenever you talk about, the physical causing the mind, because we've got minds in reality, so we either need to explain one in terms of the other. And I love how you put it like that, because then it reminds me of the more ancient and medieval principle that if we're going to suspect that something can cause something else, then we need to assume that thing that's causing it in some way, has the ability to do that. Right. And whenever I look at a mind causing regularity, that seems to be an easy, yes, of course it has the power to do that. But whenever I think of the physical causing the mental, it doesn't seem like that's a road of causality such that the physical has this ability to cause that. And it definitely makes me want to, go back to this maybe, whether we do the fifth way or a more abductive approach, it just seems like the best explanation is mind, because how could it do that unless I just don't want it to? So I'm more, I don't want to say they're biased, but
no, I appreciate it. It's a great discussion. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this with you and see what the ancient philosophers It really does startle me how much we still think in these terms and the ideas and the concepts, whether we acknowledge it or not. So appreciate our discussion today, Kyle. Thank you for joining us today on Stars, Cells, and God. And I want to encourage you to join the discussion in the comments below. Like this video and subscribe for more content. We release new episodes each Wednesday of Stars, Cells, and God right here on YouTube. Be sure to share this video, have a great conversation with your friends, and remember, the more we know about science, the more reasons we have to believe.